What do you think are 3 to 4 aspects and features that Christianity is a superior worldview to Islam, theologically, historically, or philosophically? Wow. Good question. How 3 or 4 aspects or features that Christianity is superior to a worldview to Islam, theologically, historically, or philosophically? Wow. There's I don't know, a lot I could probably say about that, but I don't know what would be the top 3 or 4, but let me just offer you a couple of thoughts here. One, I think, is the nature of God. I often have noticed that the God in Islam, that often they describe as Allah, is, well, the word that we would use, well, actually, any kind of theologian, Muslim or Christian, would be transcendent. So for God to be transcendent means that God is separate from his creation, okay? Meaning he creates the universe, but he's not the same as the universe. He's separate from the universe, okay? And so both, Yahweh and Allah are understood to be transcendent, different, separate from the creation. But the unique thing about Christianity, and I think this is one aspect or feature that I think makes it superior to Islam, is that in Christianity, God is not just transcendent, but he is immanent. Immanent, which means he enters into creation and develops a relationship with his created beings. And so for a lot of Muslims, Allah is a kind of a distant figure. He's a distant person. He doesn't condescend and come to us and relate to us in this very relatable way, like in the person of Jesus. And so I think that's one way in which Christianity theologically would be, superior to Islam. And so there's a lot more that can be said about that, but that'd be the topic. Let's see, what about historically? Well, I think there's a couple of things. Probably, I think on the topic of violence and the topic also of manuscript evidence, I think historically Christianity would have a better historical feature. And let me explain to you what I mean by that. A lot of times people will rightly recognize that Islam has the notion of jihad, and that violent jihad is a valid doctrine in Islam. I don't mean that means every Muslim is a violent person or dangerous or you shouldn't be friends with Muslims. That's not at all what I'm talking about. But if you ask simply the academic or theological question, is violent jihad a valid doctrine in Islam? It'd be hard to avoid the answer being yes, okay? And the reason why it'd be hard to avoid the answer yes is that in the majority of the main authoritative sources in Islam all affirm that violent jihad is a valid doctrine. So the Quran, which is the highest authority in Islam, there's 164 verses that teach violent jihad as a valid doctrine. I have a Quran that's published in Saudi Arabia. Let me grab it here. This one here. And what's interesting about it is that unlike a lot of Qurans that are published in the United States through American publishers or whatever, they oftentimes change the translation in such a way to make it, sound less like it condones violence. But this one doesn't. and also what's interesting is once you get to the back of the Quran, there's some appendices, okay? And there's only 4 of them. There's one on Jesus and Muhammad. There's one about Islamic monotheism. And there's also one entirely devoted to the call to jihad in the Quran. And the whole purpose of this appendix is to say, hey, look, if you miss the clear teaching that jihad is a valid doctrine in Islam, let us just remind you about where it's taught in the Quran and why it's taught in there. And so there's a whole unpacking of jihad as a valid doctrine in the Quran. So the Quran teaches that violent jihad is a valid doctrine. The Hadith, which is The written traditions about what Muhammad said and did is also teaches that violent jihad is a valid doctrine. And then the Sunnah, which is the life example of Muhammad, the Sunnah. These are three sources that also teach that violent jihad is a valid doctrine in Islam. And so when you look historically at Islam, you see a lot of violence perpetrated in the name of Islam. And maybe not all of it was justified, but you can't say that it's not taught as a valid doctrine in Islam, because it's taught in the Quran, the Hadith, and the Sunnah. Okay, three key authoritative sources. Now, many people will say, oh, but Alan, in Christianity, there's also historically been many examples of violence that have been committed in the name of Christianity. The Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades. They'll say, there's American soldiers today, many of whom are Christian, that are in the Middle East. They're killing Muslims. Look, there's all these examples of violence that is being committed in the name of Christianity. And so they'd say there's a parallel, and I'd say, no, there isn't a parallel. Those are not the same. And here's, there's probably three reasons why. Number one is this. The instances where, let me back up here. Yeah, the instances in where you have Christians forming armies and, going and killing Muslims or whatever, this is not something that is justified in the Bible, right? So yes, you do have examples of violence being committed even in the Bible, but for example, in the Old Testament with the Canaanites, for example, but these are descriptive, not prescriptive. Meaning they simply describe what happened in the Bible, but they are not made normative for Christians today. And so you can't just take some command that Joshua had to attack and import it for today and say, I have the same kind of justification. And so when you go through all the examples of when Christians engaged in violence in the past, these are all examples where they were going against biblical doctrine. They were going against biblical teaching. This was not commanded in the Bible to do such things. Whereas when you see Islam historically has situations where they engaged in violent jihad, and if you look historically how they took over North Africa, they took over the Middle East, they conquered Spain, they went into France. I mean, these are military advancements by Muslims. They could argue and point to places in the Quran where it says, yes, this is what you're supposed to do, And many Muslim scholars tell me, Alan, the reason why the Quran is more superior to the Bible is that you have parts of the Bible that aren't valid for today. Like you can't take, as they point out, the Old Testament passages and make them normative for Christians today. They say, by contrast, every injunction in the Quran can be acted upon at any instance by any Muslim, provided the same conditions arise, So anyways, I think that makes Christianity superior worldview to Islam historically, right, in this case, because you have a situation where although people have engaged in violence, in the case of Islam, oftentimes it's been done consistently, or it's more consistent with Islamic theology, whereas when Christians have engaged in violence, it is inconsistent with their theology. And and by the way, just look at, compare Muhammad and Jesus, right? Muhammad, before he died, he said, I was ordered to fight all the people until they all say there is no God but Allah, right? So his sort of like last thing he says is this command about jihad. Whereas Jesus, by contrast, was so peaceful, many people mistake him for being a pacifist, So anyways, that's just another example of some aspects about Christianity that I think make it superior worldview to Islam. So it's not all of them, but a couple of them. I also see here a comment that William Lane Craig points to the fact that Allah hates sinners, but God loved us while we were still sinners. And yes, you're right. I have heard Bill Craig talk about that. I honestly, though, I don't ever use that, though, in my conversations with Muslims. I don't know. I mean, I might just point out that the one thing I do love about the true God is that, while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Like, that's an incredible it's an incredible act of love, and certainly testifies to him, loving us in an unconditional way. And so, I know it seems like the love of a law is conditional, whereas with God it's unconditional. So that is a good point, and I know Bill Craig makes that point.